debate, so good evening everybody. Good evening debaters, students, colleagues, debaters, everybody. 1 in 4 victims of sexual assault under the age of 12 is a boy. Trans people are more likely to experience sexual violence than general population. And according to the Pentagon, 38 military men are sexually assaulted every single day. We're not going to focus on that and many other startling data out there. This debate will focus exclusively on women, because young women, this is roughly between the ages of 17 and 18 to 30-something, 32, 33, are by far the most likely social group to be victims of either attempted or completed rape and any other form of minor sexual harassment. And after decades of discussing it, this issue of sexual harassment continues to be shrouded by layers of taboo and social stigma and our own inability to very often distinguish between collective inability, that is, to distinguish between a lack of consent and complicity. And not only that, more often than that, we are also quite incapable of knowing how to help the victims. Hence this motion, because the Me Too movement has made great strides into this territory. So this House believes that the Me Too movement should prioritise redemption over retribution. And we can, it's fair to expect that the debate will shed some light on what an attitude, what potential policy to adopt in the face of sexual misconduct, perhaps before that, toxic masculinity. The Me Too movement has already changed and continues to change public discourse on sexual misconduct. What is my hope in relation to this debate is that it will help us think and speak more clearly about it all, and act accordingly, of course, as well. So, with us tonight are 6 debaters, as always, 2 teams of 3 debaters, and I'm happy to add that 2 of them, after a very long time, are students of this department. And both each in one of the teams, on side proposition, we've got 3 people, as I said. So Prime Minister, the role of Prime Minister will be adopted by Nusha, your colleague. Nusha? She's shy. And until she comes out here, they're shy people. All right, Nusha, you know her, you've seen her before. She did not take part last time. She was a timekeeper and a lady speaker. Madam Speaker, sorry, yes. But she's going to talk tonight. After her, the role of Deputy Prime Minister is adopted by Peter. You know Peter, you've known him for years. He's a 5th-year medical student. And the government's whip is Naya. She was with us last time as well. Nobody wants to show their faces tonight. Okay, you will be awarded a big round of applause at the end then. Anyway, we are welcoming you, I'm sure. She's a student of the Academy of Theatre, Radio, is this the right order? Radio, Film and TV. She's hoping to get a degree in film editing. On side opposition, the leader of opposition is Lemcha, another student of ours of this department. She is your colleague, and she'll be followed by Zoran. Zoran used to study at the... Well, show your face. I know you will show it here. Okay, later. Translation, I know. Translation department before, and now he's working towards the degree, a degree in cognitive science. I know. Pedagogical faculty. And the opposition whip is Isa. She was also here with us last time. You remember her, an impassioned speaker. She's a student at the Faculty of Social Sciences. And now, without further ado, I'm calling Nusha to, before she starts the debate, she would like to have a word with you. No, it's the commercial. Yeah, so a big round of applause at the beginning, please. Oh yeah, you are all debaters now, so we're doing it this way. Right.
So So yes, hi everyone. I just have a couple of words before we start with the debate. First of all, I want to do a promo for our debate society, because if we have a platform, why not use it? We understand that you are all very busy with your studies. We are as well, but we are always looking for new members. So if any of you have time on Wednesday at 6 p.m., we meet every time at the university headquarters at Colleges Nitug. We are very welcoming to newcomers. Levels of ability vary, so you will always be welcome there. It is not necessary that you attend every week, but if you just want to check it out, you're welcome to come. Also, we know that the content of this debate will probably also be your exam materials. So if you have any questions after the debate, you can find us on Facebook and reach us there, and we'll be, honestly, I'll be more than happy to help you.
Mind you, after the debate, you all line
Yeah,
up
we'll-
here as usual. And
we'll have a discussion, but
yeah.
I understand that some of you are shy. Don't be. Okay. I assume that most of you are familiar with the format of the debate, so I will not go into that too much. But first, before we start, I need to make a few disclaimers. Because there are some problems that arise every single debate. Okay. Debaters don't necessarily represent their own personal view when they're up here. Okay? They got assigned the side that they should stand on, and then they had to be very creative to come up with arguments. They don't necessarily represent what they actually personally believe, so in the discussion afterwards, try to attack the arguments, not the people presenting them. We are very vulnerable. Second, we are very tired, but we try. So we're going to make mistakes, but, deal with it, please. 3, 7 minutes is how long a speech should last for. 7 minutes is not a lot of time. That means that this is a very complex topic. Not everything will get covered, like probably 2% of what should get covered will get covered. So if your pet argument doesn't pop up in the debate, tell it during the discussion. Also, 7 minutes being such a small amount of time, that means we usually don't explain everything to the fullest extent, but we try to be as illustrative as possible. And because 7 minutes is not a long period, this brings me to my point number 4, language that we use. While Lincha and I might be students here, this doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes often. Those guys are EFL speakers, so they use English as a foreign language, not as a second language, which means that, except Zogan. Okay, Zogan is also English as a second language speaker. But we will be using some language that is not exactly the most appropriate in these circles. So, as Professor Gejc already said, we're actually not only going to talk about women victims, but mostly because of what we already heard. But we also believe that our cases can stand even if, and even more importantly, if the victim is actually a man. So when we use woman as a victim, we use that term gender inclusively. Second point that I already made a mistake on is victims. We understand that survivor is a preferable term, but EFL. So yes, I think this pretty much covers our disclaimers. If anything else problematic comes up during the debate, I feel like we can deal with it after it. Agreed? Okay. So, as you've already now heard, the speeches are 7 minutes long and there's 1 minute protected time on each side. During that time, the opposition team cannot ask questions of the governmental team and vice versa. Okay? This is so we can do a good intro and pick up our thoughts coherently. But during the 5 minutes of the actual speech, the other team is encouraged to ask questions. But we are not obliged to accept them. So, okay. Let us start. Unless you have any questions about the format. Great. Okay. There's an extremely qualified woman testifying before Senate. She's alleging sexual misconduct by a Supreme Court nominee. The nominee, regardless of her accusations, gets through. This inspires a record number of women to run for office. We mean for office both in Senate and in Congress. The Republican president in office makes fun of them, mocks them publicly in interviews. The effect of that whole movement of women running for office is so powerful that the year is named the Year of the Woman. The year we're talking about right now is 1992. So what went wrong? What went so catastrophically wrong that 1992 can so easily be projected as 2018? We did not have the closing step. We had a conversation, but we never decided what to do after the conversation happens. So obviously, we've been through these cycles before. It's now our obligation of this generation, not to repeat the mistakes of the past, or even, in some cases, potentially make them worse. We are in a moment of cultural, international reckoning, and it is our obligation to take it as such and to make the best out of it. We've been through #MeToo, #Time's Up. Now it's our responsibility to deal with #WhatNow. So just so we all are clear on what we're talking about, let us define some of the words in the motion. First, what do we see as redemption? We see redemption as a huge, personal, somewhat emotive step the perpetrator has to take. We believe that this should not only be an apology, but should also come with some cash donations to women organizations, shelters, to specific field opportunities, which brings me to the next point, opportunities. They should, if they are in a position of power, they should also offer opportunities to women and minorities that might not have them. And we believe that this redemption should come at a significant cost to the perpetrator. So it shouldn't be done left-handed, but it should come at a significant cost. We believe that retribution in this scenario is for those people not, because we believe that we're mostly talking about public figures, but that the whole effect will trickle down somewhat. We believe that those public figures are not allowed to appear in public spaces. And my partners will tell you why this is super problematic. And we believe that they should never again be given positions of power and not taken seriously on any topic ever again. So what does the situation look like right now? Currently, people who have had MeToo accusations made against them hire an expensive PR firm, usually go on some holiday, return in a month, 2-month period, either make no comments after the first half-hearted apology, make their way back into public life, and if they do make comments about it, they make themselves the victim. Here, I feel like something needs to be clarified. Who exactly are we talking about? Because we're clearly not talking about people like Larry Nassar or Harvey Weinstein. The language of the law is clear in those cases. They've done abhorrent acts and should be jailed. We don't think that they deserve redemption. We think that this is mostly a motion about cases like Louis C.K., about Al Franken, about people who have done some bad acts, but can still contribute to polite society. We also believe that Kavanaugh is an example of an actor who can get redeemed, not in the way he's acting right now, but if during those Supreme Court confirmation hearings, if he acted differently, if he made a sincere apology, donated some cash, we believe that he is an irredeemable actor. Okay, so why do we want to offer redemption to people? We believe that this would be beneficial for public discourse around sexual assault. So if we set Harvey Weinstein as some sort of standard, then nothing anyone ever does is bad, because he is a monster, and nothing that's less severe than his actions can ever be considered bad enough. We need shades of sexual assault. We need some sort of proportionate level. Here on this point, I just want to clarify that we all agree that all sexual assaults and misconducts are bad, clearly. But some are worse than others. We can also already see that in the language of the law, but we feel like public discourse starts to equate them. We believe that it is normal for victims to start blaming themselves, and this is caused by bad media coverage. Let us now just go through some quick examples, and let's focus on non-American countries, because we feel like their influence makes us look even worse. So first, we say that in cases like Omagnabe, who just groped some people on the dance floor, we think the public reaction to that was, this is not so bad because we're from the Balkans and we're used to worse. We believe that cases like Jan Pleseniak, who makes abhorrent sexist comments, we view them as not bad, this is just some crazy feminist complaining. We don't see those quotes as a symptom of culture that perpetuates acts like this. We have examples of people all over the public sphere, all over the also private sphere. I have a friend who is educated in gender studies, in everything, who just did not recognize that she got raped because the perpetrator didn't actually hit her during the assault. She did say no, but she viewed that the rape was not actually a rape because there was no physical violence involved. Yes?
Do you want to have sex? It's a 6-word question. It's not that difficult. You know, it's pretty clear what. So why are we muddling the waters here?
We believe that because we view consent as a complex issue, we're not used to asking for it. And even when it's clearly revoked, we believe that the first instinct of a survivor is shame, not to view it as a true rape, which feeds into this bad media narrative. And we believe that the problem of Me Too movement is if they pick retribution, it would further victimize the survivors. Which brings me to my second point, re-victimization of survivors. We believe that every survivor of a sexual assault goes through a process of healing. Look, most of them are willing and comfortable with their attack being used for political gain, because those are some actions that they all can get behind. But there is one important step that every survivor has to make, and that is to forgive on a personal level, because that leads to some clearer closure. And we believe that Me Too, taking victims' agency away to forgive, prevents them to heal. That further victimizes them, because Me Too is an actor that's supposed to be on their side. And if they prevent the most powerful act a survivor can make, this just further re-traumatizes victims of sexual assault. So we believe that redemption in all cases is better than retribution.
Thank you, Lincha, for introducing the debate and calling Lincha to continue the debate, to start the debate and continue it to side opposition.
It is not the Me Too movement's job to coddle the fragile male egos of perpetrators. So our goals as the movements are clear. It's to make societies, that is public spaces, workspaces, homes, safe and free of sexual abuse. And we do this by listening to victims, by telling their stories, by giving them a platform, but also by calling out abusers and holding them accountable. In this debate, as side opposition, we will explain to you why this accountability can only be achieved if we as a movement take an ideological hardline approach. Okay, before I get to my case, I would like to make a couple of points of rebuttal. To the point that we are standing in the way of the victim's recovery. They come up here and tell us that forgiveness is the crucial part and for the healing of the victim, and then we must be on the victim's side. Sure, we as individuals support that, and we stand by the victims. However, and we grant every right to the victim to forgive as a movement as well. But we're trying to change a societal norm that is frankly, extremely problematic, and we will only achieve this if we take a strong stance. I'll explain in a minute why exactly this works. Secondly, they also tell us that in some cases it would benefit the movement for us to forgive, for us to let the perpetrators back into public life, because they tell us that this gives us both financial support for the movement and that it helps getting the message across for our movement as well. Well, first of all, we're all for allying, but we would much rather spend our time and energy allying with people that have not been perpetrators. There are plenty of people that have no history of sexual misconduct, that have a lot of money, and that have a lot of power. Okay. Secondly, we reject this whole wishy-washy stance all in all. Now, we're not afraid to be a very radicalizing movement. Why? Because radicalizing movements work. Let's think of the 1960s, the second wave of feminism. That work that was put in was radicalizing for the time. But we see tangible results. And now contrast that to the 1990s, where we as side opposition view that conversation as way too lenient, and that is why they had no tangible results. Now, let's talk a little bit about why this zero tolerance policy actually works in the real world. First of all, what we need as a movement is a clear message. Once again, we're trying to impose a new societal norm. If this was already a societal norm, we wouldn't be having these problems, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And frankly, an alarmingly small amount of people find this today to be a societal norm. Our message is that you will get called out, and there will be consequences for all types of sexual misconduct, because none of them are okay, and there are no free passes anymore in our society. So my second argument here is that if we discuss publicly the spectrum of sexual misconduct as a movement, from minor offenses to straight-up abuse, we will inevitably harm our cause. We agree with this proportionality. We're not denying what they said, but we leave that to the policies of companies. We leave that to the language of the law. This is not our job as a movement. Because as soon as we open up this discussion as a movement, we trivialize everything within it. So we inevitably put all sexual misconduct under public scrutiny, when what happens here is that non-redeemable acts, those that both sides here today agree are non-redeemable, are under discussion as well. And especially when talking about public figures, there are so many people that will question this discussion that will open up. So many people will be there, not yet, thank you, to apologize. Fans will apologize. People themselves will apologize these acts, and maybe they'll say something like, okay, at first glance this may be bad, he did rape her, but we're not seeing all of the factors here. For example, he had a tough childhood, he was a victim of toxic masculinity. All of these excuses will be out there. We as a movement must say no. This is predatory behavior, and we will not accept it. Second of all, it will also give extra scrutiny to the victims or survivors within these scenarios. So already we have people, victim shaming is a very real thing, and it's already very prevalent. Now, if we're opening this entire thing up for discussion, we're making more room for hateful comments to befall on victims. We also run the risk of making certain crimes more acceptable, when really nothing that falls under this entire spectrum should be acceptable in society. What I'm trying to say is that maybe we're making a place for people to be, I can rope them because I can just say sorry and it's gonna be okay. No, it's never okay to do something, and it's not apologizing that will get you back. So Zoran has more to say about the tangible evidence that this stance will bring to the table. But my last point is that by doing this, by abandoning a zero tolerance policy, we are once again subjugating ourselves to the system that allowed for this toxic abuse culture to thrive in the first place. Now, we first have to examine a little bit what the Me Too movement is, okay? So it's a feminist, women-led movement, and it has limited capacities. This is very crucial. We will not use those limited capacities to redeem a system that caused the harm in the first place. We can see, if we look deeper, that this culture thrives within two overlapping systems of oppression. That is A, patriarchy, and B, capitalism. Now, we all know that capitalism devalues what can be turned into profit. Accumulation is valued over sharing. There is exploitation is valued, domination is valued, and so forth. And then patriarchy shrinks women to their caregiving roles. So we accept women's free labor. We find that it is disposable, deplorable, that it can be used as a whim, and this is the ideology that is created with the overlapping of these two systems. So it denies women all agencies. Now, women already represent the majority of care-related workers in the West, and they are there to pick up the threads when things go bad. The Me Too movement should absolutely not step once again within this characterization of the caregiving role of women, but we must reject it. We do not feel sorry if abusers are confused and uncomfortable. People who experience sexual harassment and assault never had the choice of comfort. And the Me Too movement has no obligation to clean up the mess that exists because of a broader toxic abuse culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And now it's time for Peter to resume the debate. Don't be shy with your POIs.
Right. Women having to pick up the men's messes is such a freaking novel concept, right? It's not like that's been a thing for like millennia upon millennia. We acknowledge this, right? We acknowledge that the fight for equal rights and for victims or survivors of sexual misconduct is an ongoing fight. The fact of the matter is whether the Me Too movement accepts its role within the current political discourse and actively works towards shifting that discourse in a way that opens their position up to the wider society, or if it's going to stay within its ideological purity, forsaking results in favor of that, right? So, a couple of points of rebuttal before I get to my argument. Firstly, the mischaracterization that our model is a free pass. No, in fact, we would argue that this model holds up more scrutiny to the perpetrators of sexual misconduct, right? We're not giving them a free pass. We're setting a very high bar for them to be able to redeem themselves, right? Publicly, at great expense to their own financial or social standing. But we believe this is going to bring better change in the long term, as I'll explain in my argument. Secondly, to the point of radicalization and how this needs to be the movement that shifts everything. We tell you first off that this is distracting from the real issues, right? We say consequences stay, but with proportionality, right? And to their point of like we're trivializing the suffering of victims now. No, we're actually giving ourselves more political leverage to call out the really horrible crimes. Because when a crime such as rape is perpetrated, we can completely condemn that act without being labeled as like the overly sensitive movement that is like bothered by like grabbing someone's butt, right? Not okay, but not the same thing by any means. And we say we have a clearer message under this model. Thirdly, onto this point of like it's not the Me Too movement's job to like deal with whatever. We tell you, okay, first off, even in the times of like second wave feminism and so on and so forth, right, you had a radical push for change. But in the background of that, you had millions of women working towards a productive conversation at all levels of society in order to implement large-scale change. And this is the type of large-scale, long-term change that is actually going to hold. Now, we believe that, yes, men should be uncomfortable, but not excluded from that wider conversation, because this creates a sort of us versus them mentality and discourse that can never bring us together, right? So, why it's simplistic, it's overly simplistic and infantile to say in essence that, well, it's not the Me Too movement's job, right? Other people can deal with this. It's not, right? Because the Me Too movement is such an integral part of the conversation we're having right now. It started the conversation. It's a central player in the conversation, and it's morally right, and it's in the Me Too movement's interest to stay a central part of that conversation and to guide it. Not be labeled as a radical fringe part of the conversation, while Fox News and a bunch of other pundits who have not been there, who have not experienced sexual misconduct, to sort of rationalize on like whatever the discourse should be in terms of proportionality. Now on to my argument. I'll tell you why the zero tolerance policy discourages any meaningful change by inherently creating this atmosphere of exclusion. First thing we need to realize is that a significant proportion of perpetrators don't do this as a conscious defiance of social norms, right? They're not like, well, I know this is wrong, but I have a penis, so I can do it, yay. Right? We tell you that to a certain extent, this is caused by like this brutal socialization that boys go through still in most of Western culture, including emotional starvation and this inbreeding of toxic masculinity without real access to influences or channels that they can learn behavior from. Now we're talking about these men, right? And in essence, if we have a zero tolerance policy, you provoke two types of responses within these perpetrators. Firstly is the deny and combat response, taken up by the likes of Kavanaugh, right? So we tell you that there is no way of redemption, so we're just gonna deny it and we're gonna attack the victim back. We tell you more men or more perpetrators will choose this method if they know that there's absolutely no way for them to get out of like the disgrace of the public after they've committed a crime of varying proportion. I tell you this will lower the discourse, rally the emotionally stunted alpha males behind their rhetoric, and most importantly, demean the victims of this sexual assault or sexual misconduct, right? And this is going to largely negatively affect the public discourse as well as the lives of the victims, which is certainly not something we want if we force them into this sort of option. The second option that they have is the sort of accept and step down approach, right? Let's say Al Franken, right? With which we're aware of the irony of Al Franken, like stepping down and completely removing himself from like public discourse, where Trump is still sitting in office with all of his joyous quotes. So generally we say that these men have a potential to see the error of their ways and contribute to the conversation in a positive manner. Now, if we keep attacking them, and by attacking I mean telling them that there's no way for them to redeem themselves, there's absolutely no way you will ever be accepted by society ever again, it means that less of them will choose this option and will go into the first group of deny and combat. But more importantly, we're going to lose allies within the conversation that we could have, right? They tell you, no, we need ideological purity. We need our message to be heard. But like the target audience of the Me Too movement, the ones that follow the Me Too movement, aren't really the ones that need this message most, right? The people who need this message most are like the bros who listen to Louis C.K. Now we say that if Louis C.K., for example, changed his ways, right, publicly acknowledged the problem, had a stand-up show about women's rights or like the wrongs he did, contributes money to women's shelters and legal aid, we say that he can reach his specific audience. So the audience that is not already predisposed to accept the Me Too movement's message, to internalize the values of like doing away with sexual misconduct. And it's this platform that the Me Too movement can effectively utilize by embracing the redemption of those individuals who are A, not beyond redemption, and B, willing to do this in order to get back in the public eye, right? And we tell you we get a much wider impact under our model. Because we reach the target audience, we get like this financial boost to the Me Too movement's causes, and we change more minds where the minds need changing most. So all in all, what we told you on Side Government today is that true. It's not fair, it's not great that mostly women still, after all of this time, need to deal with men's emotional baggage. But the fact of the matter is, like it or not, it's the best way we're going to achieve large-scale change, right? It's the best way to stay relevant in the conversation. It's the best way to reach the most people that we can and shift the discourse and get people to internalize these values as best we can. So we say, take responsibility for it and own up to the what's next part of the Me Too movement.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think it's Zoran who will speak next.
Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity, speaking from the perspective of Audre Lorde, a black lesbian feminist poet that was living and creating in the 80s. She continues, women are expected to educate men. Lesbians and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual worlds. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. And this is what is happening again and again in social movements, and this is the discourse we're kind of hearing again today. And it does not work to embrace this, your own oppression, so maybe you can assimilate to some system that screwed you up in the first place. What I want to do, first of all, is to go through some rebuttal and then extend upon our two constructive points. One, which is to say the way we have the economic system and the gender notions kind of interact, and we have to deal with that if we want to talk about any tangible form of equality on the long run. And I will also tell you why radicalism works in the way that it does. But first of all, let's deal with this whole framing of this debate. We've been discussing these people who did some really terrible acts or some less terrible acts, but then Peter comes up and says, oh, but we also have this thing with toxic masculinity that's kind of driving all of these issues. So obviously redemption cannot be just about one person not, donating some money, or which is kind of analogous to the hush money that was given to these victims in some cases. What actually has to happen is a radical transformation of how we practice masculinity in our societies. And this is not something that can be done necessarily by a women-led movement, because they're not the only factor in play here, and it's also unfair that we expect them to do it. But if you want to go some alternative way, well, then it's a really weak kind of steps you're making. Yes, Nusha.
Are you aware of a single person standing as a symbol of a revolution? Examples where that can happen, Rosa Parks, things like that.
Yeah, but this is again this discourse that will have this redeeming male ally that will step in. But this is also a very different case, because typically, yes, you do take up some, I won't say crap that's thrown at you, but I just said it, as a marginalized community or as a powerless community fighting. But what you do is you advocate for your own rights and your own dignity, and through it you actually can get people to recognize your own dignity and your own humanity. But what will happen is, the twist here is that suddenly a women-led movement should be able to sort of rehabilitate these men who have obviously been perpetrators. This is a very important difference that we have to make here, right? So it's not only about this individual redemption, it has to be collective transformation. Further on, they have been talking about this proportionality. We say you can still be kind of retributive and still be proportional. It's one thing if I say, please stop that. It's another one if I say, if you don't stop that, I'll report you. It's another thing that if a company has an internal policy that says, okay, if you really cross that line, there will be some sanctions. And there's also the legal system that takes care of the harsher cases. So you have these grades of proportionality, proportional to what kind of sexual harassment is going on, and we don't see this problem of proportionality really here. And when it comes to this wishy-washiness about what is consent and what is not consent, well, at least in the feminist circle, it is quite clear. So sex without consent can be potentially rape, or in a legal case, if you have a progressive system, it opens up the most possibilities so people can speak out. And as I'll explain later, this needs to happen. Yes, Peter.
So what are the inherent harms of a guy like fully embracing his faults and the Me Too movement going, right, that's fine. we accept your apology.
It is very naive to think that this just happens overnight. Even the Me Too movement did not happen overnight. It was founded in 2006 by, as far as I know, by a black woman, mainly to support people of color in cases of sexual assault. Also, the women who were actually doing these high-profile cases didn't appear out of nowhere, but were talking and fighting each other because it's, it's white rich people doing serial rape, basically. And it took years and years of networking and building and energy to create that moment. And if we want to have this guy coming back into society with this redemptive feature, that will not happen on itself, right? Somebody will have to facilitate the conversation. Somebody will have to put in physical work. And we say the Me Too movement is not the platform to do it. And then Peter comes up and says, well, but men shouldn't be excluded. But what's actually, in this case, the relative barrier to speaking? The barrier to speaking and opening up, actually sharing your stories of sexual assault is really, really, really high, because only 2 to 10% of sexual assault cases get reported according to some research. And from 2003, the police records from the US show that 2.1 cases were false reports. And yet again, this reaction that survivors, when they share their story, is that, oh, we don't believe you. And it's not very uncommon that women sharing their stories are professionally then disadvantaged, are kind of attacked, their career basically disintegrates, right? This is the price that women are exposed to when they speak about their own experience of sexual harassment or sexual assault in this case. And what we believe that we should demand this same level of uncomfortability from men who want to be allies. So it's not just about you saying, oh, what can I do now in the office? Well, look at how grave the problem is. If you're afraid that you'll say something that's wrong, I think you need to be braver, right? Because women, if they speak out, they face these risks, and why shouldn't we expect the same thing from men if they want to be allies in the first place? Right. And now to wrap it up with our own constructive material, we believe this movement has to be radical, because only when you have this beacon of radicality, you pull the society on your side. So the effects of Me Too have been that the Ombudsman for Equal Employment Opportunities in the US reported a 50% increase in reports after Me Too in 2017. Now, this same story happened with police reports of sexual assaults in Canada. So you see that once you have the Me Too shining over there, people get inspired and move towards that. It applies to men, because even with this whole narrative of Me Too being as kind of retributive in the status quo, men in some polls have said that they are now more likely to speak out when they see sexism, and also you had startups forming because companies were interested in training their employees in sexual harassment prevention. So you had this capital flowing in, and Google saying, oh, we actually want to do that, because you had this radical movement who was very consistent with what they want and went for it, and then suddenly this transformation in the society happened. Because change is not a solo performance, change is a concert, and in this song of transforming masculinity, the Me Too movement will take a pause, and it's right so that it takes a pause. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoran. And now it's time for the concluding speech on side proposition. Naya.
Okay, so when I first came out to my very conservative grandpa, right, he said he would rather see me as a junkie than a gay person. And since then, I've had to tolerate a lot of hurtful, ignorant language from him. That was not necessarily a product of malice, but rather of ignorance and, the narrative of how society works in which he grew up and was forced upon him his whole life. Now, is it fair that I've had to take the responsibility on my shoulders to explain again and again of how, it's not just that I haven't met the right guy yet, or, go through this kind of painful conversations that, it's not fair for me to go through because we live in a world where this is the case. No, it's not fair. Is it fair that I had to maybe calm his ego along the way because that was the only way for me to actually re-educate him on the matter? Again, it's not fair. But what is the result of this effort that I put in? The result is that now I have a grandpa who is an actual ally, right? But not a fake one, a real one. An ally who takes pictures of me at the Pride Parade and an ally who hugs my girlfriend. So you see that the kind of, pretentious ideological position that we're getting from side opposition of how we as a movement and as victims of the patriarchy and capitalism are too good to deal with any of the issues that we have in it because it's not fair that we have them in the first place is completely unproductive and will achieve no societal change in the long run. And second of all, we note how even though we agree we should strive for greater systematic change, they have provided us no examples or no analysis on how this systematic change will actually emerge in their system. And also, if they did, we see that this systematic change is never guaranteed, whereas our step-by-step progress ensures real change for the people of today. Okay, so first a point of clarification, and then I'll move on to my two big points of analysis, ideology versus pragmatism, and secondly, this retribution versus redemption in practice, right? So first clarification. Now, they've been focusing a lot on, how we have limited resources and how, it's not the Me Too movement's priority to kind of make this statement of redemption. And to that we say, first of all, the motion before the House is that we should prioritize redemption over retribution when the question emerges of redemption over retribution, and when the question emerges, what do we do when a perpetrator of like a minor sexual assault is actually wants to be redeemed? What do we do when this person publicly claims to its fan base, that is an audience we could never reach otherwise, that they made a mistake and that this is not how it should work? What do we do when this person offers $10 million to the legal defense fund founded by the Me Too movement? No thanks, Zoran. So what do we do when all of this happens? Where should the Me Too movement stand? And we say, in that case, we should stand on the side of redemption. We're not saying that this should be the top priority of the Me Too movement, because this is not what the debate is about, right? So I think they're just kind of distracting you with this whole, oh my God, we're focusing on the straight guys when we should be doing other things. We're saying that when it comes to this question, we have to make a firm stand on this side. Second thing I need to clarify is that is the whole thing about they're accusing us of not sending a clear message about consent and rape and stuff. We've claimed in the first speech, right, that some things are not open for discussion, right? We agree that rape is terrible. We agree that some people should be in jail and never forgiven. We've said this in our first speech, and we think it's very misleading from side up to kind of accuse us of, having a wishy-washy definition of sexual assault. Okay, so let me move on to my first point of analysis. The question that is very crucial for this debate is, as Zoran has built up his entire speech on this without tackling any Peter's material, is it better to stay ideological pure and refuse any kind of action except maybe very radical action? Or is it better to compromise to achieve little steps of change along the way? Now, we claim it is better to compromise, and we'll show you this in 3 points of analysis. Now, first of all, we're saying that big systematic change is not mutually exclusive with little steps and compromising. We see that not only is it not mutually exclusive, it's what in the end might bring us to the big systematic change, and it's what in the end will bring us to the big shift in mentality and to the solving of the toxic masculinity that they claim that we need to solve. We've seen this in examples of other movements as well, right? They mention how feminists in the 60s were successful because they were radical. We tell you that feminists in the 60s were a lot of groups, some of which were radical and they raised a lot of dust, but there were millions of women working on, conversation, working on everyday little minor legal issues, pouring a lot of work into things that are not as glamorous as, burning your bra or your PhD. We see that the most radical branch of the 60s feminism were the Furies, which were like an extremist, all lesbian women's group who didn't allow women to bring their male infants to gatherings because all men are pigs, right? And we see that those movements actually within the most radical sects made more harm than good to the movement because they created a huge negative backlash. So you see that they brought no real evidence of how radicalism works. We see furthermore historically the LGBT movement 50 years ago when they started their fight, and in most EU countries of today, being gay was illegal, literally. And if they said at that time, you know what, we need to have a zero tolerance policy for all forms of bigotry, we will not accept anything less than a complete shift in mentality of heteronormativity, and we will not accept anything except full equal rights, that they would achieve nothing, right? But they had to first settle with the fact that decriminalization was a big win as a start. And then step by step, with little wins and with educations and with making allies within the straight heteronormative community, we are also changing this heteronormative mentality. So we see that it's not mutually exclusive. We see that we have brought a lot of analysis of how not only is it not mutually exclusive, but how we, as supporters of like the redemption factor, are actually promoting this kind of mentality shift as well. Because as Peter explained and as Zoran failed to tackle at all, people who are, these perpetrators have an audience that we would never be able to reach because this audience is feeling super attacked and super defensive because of their kind of dialogue. These perpetrators, if they decide to redeem themselves, they'll make a clear statement and influence people that we could never influence ourselves. And again, I say, is it sad that we need like straight guys explaining to other straight guys to not be dicks to people? Yes, but such is life. It's not fair, but we want a better world for our children. We're prepared to take on our shoulders the burden of having to deal with, ignorant people and with unfair conditions, if I know that, for example, my daughter will live in a world where this is not, and my sons or whatever, like in a world where this is not a societal norm anymore, okay? So we see that this is the fact of the ideology factor is that systematic change is not guaranteed in our case, and in our case, real change in real life is guaranteed, and further on, big systematic change can also emerge, and it's not mutually exclusive. And I'm out of time for any of my other points. We beg you to propose a motion.
Thank you, Naya, for your impassioned conclusion. And Isa, it's your time to do the same for the opposition.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, time is clearly up. We do not want this last year to repeat the 1992 issues. We have to be radical. We have to make a stance. It is far too difficult to live in a world where sexual harassment is normalized and it is trivialized, and we are not going to get rid of this problem by holding the hands of the perpetrators. We need to tackle this with a zero-tolerance policy, a policy that will make change. We cannot be loose on the perpetrators, and we cannot be loose on the ideology. We have to understand how pressing these problems are, and this is not the best way to tackle them, to put all of the burden on a movement with limited capacity to solve absolutely all the problems that society has to offer. So firstly, let's talk about the Me Too movement and what it is here to do and represent, right? The Me Too movement is not for the perpetrators, it is for the victims. It is for the victims to share their stories, to have a safe space to do so, right? It is extremely hard for all of the victims of Harvey Weinstein, of other such perpetrators, to really come out. They have been under pressure, under even Secret Service members, to actually keep their stories quiet. And it takes a lot of courage and a lot of, courage and power of these women who have to come out. And that is important. The movement is for them. It is for calling out perpetrators and making sure that what is happening is no longer an open secret, right? We have to make this a priority, and it is here for the victims to call out the problems, right? So let's go through what, side proposition brought here, right? They were talking about how we need to have this closing step, right? And how this closing step is forgiving, the perpetrators. This is absolutely ridiculous, right? We don't need a closing step yet because we're not even close to being in the midway point of tackling this huge problem, right? This is a huge systematic issue, right? And the Me Too movement isn't the only actor that needs to be dealing with it, right? It is the actors that started the conversation, yes, but it does not have the absolute burden to lead the conversation, hold the hands of the poor male egos that are actually the perpetrators, and absolutely, clarify everything for the public discourse that we're having, right? It has a limited capacity, and what it should be doing is giving this platform to the victims and making sure that the public discourse is clear and really, targets the people people who did this and make sure there's a zero tolerance policy, make sure that is absolutely well known in society, make sure that these things and these men are feeling uncomfortable and do not get to have a second platform to talk about how sorry they are. No, thank you. And we have to be clear on this, right? We do not want 1992 to repeat itself, right? We do not want to go back to what we had, right? We understand there are huge societal problems, but we think the Me Too movement's place is to make sure that we know these problems exist, to give these sort of platforms to the survivors, to the perpetrators, and to make sure that even a guy groping a waitress at a bar knows what he's doing is absolutely unforgivable. So we have to be strong and we have to be radical for us to have change. So what did they really bring to us, right? This idea of these people becoming, allies and how this is great, how these are going to change so much, right? We don't care. We want allies, certainly, but we do not want these allies to be the perpetrators of the things we are fighting, ladies and gentlemen, right? And saying, well, they're, poor little victims of toxic masculinity is completely ridiculous. We understand toxic masculinity is a huge problem, right? But we shouldn't be like holding their hand and saying, no, it's television and society's fault that you did this to a woman. We believe that full responsibility should be taken by these people who committed these acts. And we believe we do that by making sure that the public figures who made these decisions are made an example, and we make sure that they do not re-enter public life, even though they've made a lot of money to certain movements and, just apologize. Because we do not believe that they are the appropriate allies for these movements, right? So we just say, we don't care if they're going to give us money. We want the right kind of allies. We want the people who do not make these huge problems and do not make women's lives living hell, right? All right, yes, go.
So how does this help when we either push men into denying their actions
I'm getting to that, thank you. Right, and then there is this idea of as Pero said, we're pushing them and just deny and combat, right? We don't believe that this is necessarily true, right? He gave this idea of Brett Kavanaugh, right? But we also had this problem in the 1990s. But we have to say, no, we have to be absolutely radical. We have to understand that the person in the White House should probably be in jail for sexual assault, right? We have to understand that this is problematic, and we're going to say, look, we have to make the discourse absolutely zero tolerance, right? We can't just be like, you might be forgiven for making problems. We don't believe that they're just going to deny and combat. We have to change societal discourse to the point where they're absolutely going to be removed from public office, removed from making more and more problems, right? We don't believe that saying, well, you'll be forgiven if you give a pile of cash and say you're really, really sorry, we say that's not good enough, right? And it's not good enough for the women, right? And here they're talking about also how this is great for the victims because the movement allows them to forgive, which is the most important and powerful thing they can do. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get serious. Even if the victims want to personally forgive their attackers, we do not believe that is a good idea for the movement, right? These attackers need to know what they did was wrong and they need to be reprimanded properly for their actions. That is also a hugely important part, right? And this movement should be standing for the victims, right? Saying we'll forgive your perpetrator is ridiculous, right? They are sharing their stories in the hopes that something will happen, even to the individuals that hurt them personally. And this is the movement's job, right? So, and then there's this other idea that they'll just remove themselves from public life. We say, oh right, that's also maybe a good thing, right? We don't want them to stand in public life knowing what they have done, really kind of, promoting what they did, and still, even if we forgive them, we trivialize the things they're doing, right? When we say, oh, it's not as bad if you grope women, we say, yeah, it's not as bad, but it equally is unforgivable, right? We still have to have a zero tolerance policy when we're talking about sexual assault, because in today's society, it is such a huge problem that saying, well, we'll forgive you if you give us enough cash is not good enough. We have to be clear. We have to be strong. It is the same with sexual assault, which I don't know what was exactly put in this debate in general, but I'm saying we have to be clear. This does not have and should not have a gray area. What you're doing is wrong, and as the Me Too movement, we should stand for absolute retribution. Right? So let's further on examine how, in Nea's speech, there was a lot of, saying that Zoran didn't rebuttal things and ad hominem attacks. But okay, let's be clear, right? We're also talking about how we need to change society and societal discourse, right? And we do not believe that giving a platform to the people who are perpetrating is actually a good thing, right? These are communities who have had to fight for this platform, and they should not be able to give this platform up, right? This Me Too movement is not for white men who are the, victims of toxic masculinity. This movement is for women to finally speak up and say no more. We are going to take the platform, we are going to take the discourse, and we do not care what they say. We are not going to hold their hand. We want change, and with this radical stance, we will not repeat the problematic things that happened in 1982. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem has gotten far too big to coddle the male ego. We need to be radical, we need to be clear, and we need to say there is a zero tolerance policy for absolutely all forms of sexual harassment and assault. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and especially Isa for this impassioned conclusion. And you did a good job as well. You all did. Yeah, I know you had 3 times as much material as you were able to disclose. Anyway, thanks again, and I'm opening the floor to everybody. Question, maybe you have a comment or...
Should we move?
Yeah, well, do come out here, are removed from the scene, or invited from the scene, and you just start the conversation.
Also need to take this.
I want to fit.
Okay, so I think that asking the survivors to forgive their abusers basically would actually discourage them from coming out with their story, because it would feel like they'll be pressured to forgive them even if they don't want to. And then like the abusers who want to get redemption would be like, oh, I'm sorry, you should forgive me. And then like everyone who agrees with them would be like, oh yeah, you should forgive them. Why are you so horrible? Why won't you be like...
We don't actually require survivors to forgive the perpetrators. But we think that when a movement steps in and says, you, on a personal level, forgiving your attacker harms our cause. So we don't want you, as a human being, to forgive, even if you feel capable of doing so. So we don't think that we would in no case force them to apologize, but if they to forgive, well, but if they want to, we believe that like Me Too preventing them from doing so by seeking retribution is the problematic part.
Although, if I can step out of the debate world, really, I mean, there's this line of like restorative justice that goes into this, but it's not just saying, oh, I'm sorry, lol. There are some approaches that are based on mediation, but these are like month or even year-long processes of talking to the parties, figuring their stance, and it's also voluntary, so people can step out. But you know, this is like a completely different approach. Needs like a different organization that can facilitate this process, and it takes a long time, right? So it's like an option, but it's a very specific way of dealing with that. But a benefit you get from that is that the community can then address the entire story, right? And I think one of the organizations that's working on like intersectional justice wanted to pursue such kind of engagement, because the conversations you get out could be used for like justice on multiple fronts. Because one of the problems, for example, with, well, it depends, I mean, yeah. So one of the problems with even harsher punishments for, let's say, for sexual offenses, is that if the justice system is like racially biased, you know, then you have this seesaw. So you increase some protection for women, but you destigmatize, you know. And then the question is, how do you break out of this, right? And one way would be to take a look at the entire context, to engage the entire community, but it's a very different way of operating than what this advocacy thing, you know, let's support court cases, stuff like that. So it's like an option, but it's a very different philosophy that is there, right? And then I think you won't have the pressure, right? as well, because it's a very it's a 100-step process.
Yep.
I think I wanted to start from is the radical movement's argument is that one of the reasons why it's radical is because it gains a lot of traction with people, and I think one of the reasons for that might be because it makes a sort of they versus us versus them mentality, which does of course work, but I don't really like how it very much, of course, sexual assault and everything is entirely bad and unjustified and everything, but I don't like the fact that it entirely dehumanizes the perpetrators. The thing is that with the radical movement is that it just says they did this bad thing and that's it, nothing else. We're not talking about why they did it, when, how, what the context of the situation was, what the background was. It just says this happened, we need to stop it. I think a better approach would be to actually tackle the issue of why that actually happened, because it's most likely because of some sort of past mental trauma with the perpetrator. Because no normal person would want to do that. No normal person says,
I mean,
I'm going to...
I completely disagree.
Yeah.
I completely disagree in a sense. No, like seriously.
Okay.
No, like seriously, because I think one of the things here is that there's like this power play, right? When the argument we were trying to make that there's like a connection between these gender role stereotypes we have and these economic inequalities we have. And I think, at least in the Me Too movement, it was often the case that it was this quid pro quo, so I force you to have sex and you get some favors. So there is this power moment and people want it, right? And they're in a situation where nobody's watching and they think they can get away with it because they're powerful enough and then they do it. So I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, you poor traumatized, you know?
No, for that situation, I agree,
yeah.
yes. I was more thinking about...
I'm sure that's not what he's saying. You know?
I was just thinking about just like randomly someone, not randomly, but someone just getting sexually assaulted on the street or wherever. But that I agree with as well, yes.
Can I point out that we all agree that it's dangerous to put these things up for discussion? You know, what exactly happened? Was this person traumatized as a child? Does this justify what he did? We all agree, I mean, even within the debate, that we have to say whatever the context is, you know, all sexual assault is bad.
Of course.
But we definitely agree with you on the point that us versus them is a toxic dialogue that is not, you know, contributing anything good to anybody at this point. And the only way we can actually achieve changes right now, and, you know, a mentality shift of masculinity or whatever, is to open the dialogue up more and, you know, not to make people feel completely excluded from it.
I agree completely, because it is true that if we were to use that technique of actually looking through the background, a lot of people can use that for their own good, you know, if they actually don't have any sort of negative background. So I would rather, though, have that and have some sort of system. I'm not sure what, I haven't really thought this through entirely, of course, but have some have some system where it tries to erase that discrepancy as much as it can. I'd rather have that than just us versus them, and that's it.
The problem with us versus them is that it also further radicalizes both sides.
Yeah.
Not to both sides, it's argument, but...
It disconnects them.
I mean, I again disagree on that. No, because like you know, it's this issue of proportionality. So like, I was reading this idea on when talking about climate change. So how much fear should we use, right? So should we paint this apocalyptic picture? And I think you can make the argument that it depends on what the situation is, how severe you want to make the rhetoric. And if you take the perspective that like sexual assault is like an issue that's still invisible and that still has dire consequences, I think you can say, well, the rhetoric has to be proportional, because when it is like radical, then it's kind of equalizing for the fact that it's kind of invisible, right? But I do acknowledge. I mean, sure, like you need this dialogue thing to get going, and it's super uncomfortable to face your privileges. I mean, let's be completely honest. And men have privileges, and we need to face them.
Yes, and that's all true and fine. But like all of the things you're saying are
applicable, if you're putting the dialogue into an intellectual elite. But like we need to dial down the pretentious analysis.
Yeah.
Like seriously, because if we want to achieve actual change, we need to reach the majority of the population, and we need to make a sort of dialogue that we'll all understand.
Exactly. Instead of preaching to the already convinced, because it's a lot less.
Because this is just preaching this kind of thing within your own choir.
I think also radicalization might help some women to some extent, because I feel like a lot of the times when it is invisible is because the victims don't really step out. When they know that in the society there is this sort of discourse that this is completely unacceptable, it's much easier for them to also recognize that something terrible has happened to them and that this is extremely wrong. So I feel like the sort of us mentality that might actually be helpful to some victims to come out and might actually provide some sort of community that might also be very efficient. So I think it goes both ways. I think the discourse in society should generally shift, but I also think that sometimes radical is fine.
Yeah, sometimes it is.
Sometimes
Sometimes it's fine.
Yeah.
But I don't see how that would be the only way to make sure. To make sure like victims feel like they have a community.
I agree with you on what you said, because emotions are a very powerful thing. So if someone is scared, they're less likely to do something in both cases. So if the victim is scared, they'll get pressured, or if something bad will happen when they come out, then they won't tell it. But at the same time, if the other person is pressured that something bad will happen if they do it, then they're also less likely to do it. So that's why I think pressure is a good thing sometimes. It's not.
Yeah?
Does anyone else want to ask? Because I don't want to keep asking.
I have an eye on them.
Okay. I just want to ask a simple question. Do those positive aspects of radicalization that you mentioned, do you think those actually outweigh the whole entire consequences that I think would be a bit more negative of radicalization?
I think it's sort of similar, at least in my opinion, to radical feminist movement. It's not the only it's a branch which can be efficient in providing some benefits. And I think the Me Too movement, in my personal opinion, at least this time, is kind of on board with it. I think it's supposed to be a radical movement. I think it's supposed to be I think at least the discourse it creates should be radical, and it should be based on, the victims and the kind of retribution of the perpetrators. But I think there are other movements and there are other discussions who are also tackling the similar sort of issue in different ways that are not as radical. I don't think it's a one or the other. I think in society there's always plurality. I think the radical side is also important to get change.
Yeah, you can play this good cop, bad cop game. It's okay. I mean,
You could do it.
Was there a question there? I saw you move your head.
No?
Okay. I saw you move your head and I thought you had a question. Yeah?
Maybe a question for the proposition. I had a thought. Could it, when you were talking about the spectrum of how bad it can be, of criticize, but that's maybe a legality issue. So for the movement, how do you tell a victim that the guy who traumatized you is redeemable?
No, I feel like that's definitely an issue here of like the individual versus the movement, right? So sometimes, and I feel like that's true for, like, no movement is going to 100% represent all of the individual needs of all of its members. So I feel like in that particular case, we're trying to make the distinction of, like, regardless of the individual level, it's beneficial for the movement to take this more nuanced approach in order to get all of these benefits that we can in terms of, like, the public discourse. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I feel like both this and what the actual path to redemption looks like is decided on a case-to-case basis. Because it can't be like norm. norms cannot be set up to deal with any and all given case. So
Also, I feel like the personal and public redemption are two completely different stories. So in essence, that like the personal redemption really can't even happen on a public platform, in essence, right? So you read a lot about these college campus sexual assault cases, where you have the public discourse going on of like a certain group, let's say calling out the perpetrator, and then like the perpetrator and his like general group of people radicalizing in itself, whereas the individual level is like the victim or the survivor needing a certain face-to-face interaction, right? So I feel like that is a different thing, right? So what does the movement say is all right for the person to be publicly redeemed and accepted back into their, let's say, workplace, be it like in television or any sort of other public sphere, and then the individual needs of the survivor.
Yep.
Yeah, may I ask, what do you mean about when you speak about like public redemption? Like, what do you mean with public? Like going to social media or like on broadcast TV or what?
It's
like
because we're mostly talking about public figures who already have like a presence in the public, because they're like politicians or movie
Like,
stars
okay.
or TV anchors or influential people, and this is why.
So that is to say, what the stance of, let's say, the movement or a significant group of the public mind's reaction to this individual is on a general societal level, and whether or not we choose to, let's say, resume consuming content that they create, if they're a media person, or accept them back into office if they're a politician. That balance with the individual level of what the specific person who is a survivor of that act needs in that situation. So I think that's the difference, right? So the public's reaction to the perpetrator as opposed to.
Yep.
How would the redemption look like for someone who is a public figure?
Case-to-case basis, honestly. I feel like this is a conversation that's missing from the current moment. We're all just talking about how horrible everything is and that some step needs to be made, but nobody knows what that step is. We decided on just like emotive personal apology thing and cash and opportunity aspect of everything, because we feel like that can be applied to pretty much anyone on that public sphere, but we feel like in actual real life situation it would be determined on a case-to-case basis, again in accordance to proportionality of their offenses.
So why don't you, like, if you talk about case-to-case basis, why don't you decide on case-to-case basis, like if the victim decides to choose redemption or retribution?
Well,
Yeah, that's reasonable.
It's really hard for the victims. I read some of the stories, and it's such a long process. I think it's hard for them to like even decide between redemption or retribution, but it's easier for them.
And honestly, I feel like every retribution involves redemption and vice versa. So it's very hard to separate those two terms. They're always going to come hand in hand somewhat. We just don't think that perpetrators should be like isolated for the rest of their lives, unless sometimes they should.
And in relation to what you said, like that would be a good debate, but it's the reason why we, didn't talk about it is because we're debating this motion, and it's
Sometimes you have
it's a
to.
different debate. Maybe there should be a debate like this house believes that the victims should decide who should be like redeemed and who.
victim.
Yeah, there are
Victim.
but still, like no, but it's let's vote. Like I agree, and it's a very good thought. It's
Yeah.
just, that's why we didn't talk about it, because it's a different motion.
I also feel like to a certain extent nowadays the movement also, representing individual victims, but also represents a wider societal interest. So in essence, demanding from public people to repay the debt that they caused within society, right? So the damage that they caused within the wider spectrum of society with their actions, with the loss of faith in them or in their projects or in a certain industry and so on and so forth. So I think that it's the case-to-case basis definitely is something that has to happen when it comes to the individual victim. Whereas I feel like it's a different debate for.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps this is the moment when we are like stepping out of the debate actually, because even the format itself, I think, has some limitations. And one of the things I would say is that it really depends on what's happening in a very specific environment, because it's very hard to copy paste. You can like copy paste some approaches, but then how the whole system works together, it's very complicated, right? So you could probably have a panel on how to do this in a specific context, bring in local NGOs and then, but that's a different conversation that we can't have in this format, but you know, we have to pick and choose in life.
Workshops. Anyone else?
Well, I can contribute one, because usually there is this half-baked apology, but there was this one case of a positive apology that I think is a case for the redemption story. So I think it was some TV producer, Harmon, I think. So basically, he was accused of making sexual comments and making his co-workers uncomfortable, and later he acknowledged it, and he really in details explained how he now understands that this was really detrimental to work environment, to comfort, to how safe, how well those women around him could actually even do their job. And I think that's kind of a point for the redemption, because in this case he really proved that he understands. He wasn't just saying, oh, I'm sorry that you were offended. He said, oh, I actually understand why I hurt you, and I'm sorry, and I will try to not do this. And some of the victims said that the fact that he shows that he actually understands really makes them feel better and kind of allows things to move forward. So I think it's certainly possible, but only if it really includes the understanding of the situation, not just you said that you're hurt.
Anyone else? Anything else?
It's been a long day.
So can I just then say just one more thought that I couldn't include in the debate because it's completely random, but I heard it today and I kind of love it. It's that Me Too is weaponized gossip. Which means
what? Weaponized?
Weaponized gossip. Because gossip is a predominantly female activity, because those open secret situations, everyone knew about every one of those cases, and it was mostly kept quiet in a gossipy way. Hey, please don't work with that guy because he gets super gropey. And cases like this. But now that Me Too arose, they kind of weaponized that to their own advantage, and I thought it was a nice analogy. Yes. So keep that in mind. Next time you go.
I'm super looking forward to our debate after debate, and thank you very much for your contribution. I think and thank you for being such a responsive audience. Good night.